James stood on the bridge. It wasn't the first time that thought had crossed his mind, but it was the first time his feet had actually brought him there. It was 3 in the morning on an ordinary Tuesday, and the city slept, oblivious to the silent torment of yet another of its inhabitants. The cold March wind bit at his face, but he barely felt it. For months, he'd felt nothing but that corrosive emptiness that consumed every inch of his existence. His fingers trembled as they gripped the icy concrete railing. It wasn't fear. It was the last flicker of something he couldn't even name anymore. Just one step, he thought. One step, and all this is over. 3 years ago, James was a different person. A sales manager at a tech company, married to Sarah for 5 years, and father of a 7-year-old daughter named Emma. He had a house in the suburbs, a new car, and vacation plans. His life was ordinary, stable, even happy on the surface. But appearances lie, and James had become an expert at lying. It all started with small things: trouble sleeping, increasing irritability, a persistent feeling of inadequacy at work. He ignored the signs. "It's just stress," he told himself. "It'll pass." But it didn't. Insomnia turned into sleepless nights. Irritability erupted into violent arguments with Sarah. The feeling of inadequacy crystallized into an absolute certainty of failure. James began arriving late to work, avoiding meetings and leaving projects unfinished. His performance plummeted. The pitying and disapproving looks from his colleagues were knives in his already shattered self-esteem. Sarah tried to help. She suggested therapy, offered support, tried to understand. But James had built walls so high that even he couldn't climb them. Every loving gesture from Sarah felt like an accusation. Every hug from Emma, a reminder of how much he was failing as a father. Their love, which should have been his safe haven, became a cruel mirror, reflecting his inadequacy. "They would be better off without me," this thought began as an occasional whisper, and gradually became a deafening scream that occupied every waking moment. Then came the dismissal, inevitable but devastating. James didn't fight, didn't argue, just packed his belongings into a cardboard box under the awkward gaze of his former colleagues. In that moment, something inside him shattered definitively. Sarah tried to keep her family together, but she was fighting an impossible battle against an invisible enemy who had replaced the man she loved. The bills piled up. The arguments intensified. Emma began to have nightmares. On the bridge, James closed his eyes. He thought of Emma, of her smile, which he hadn't seen in weeks because he could no longer look her in the eye. He thought of Sarah, whose patience he had exhausted, whose love he had tested to its limit. He thought of himself, or rather of the stranger he had become. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text from Emma, sent hours earlier, that he was only just seeing. "Dad, I love you. When will you come back to play with me?" The tears finally came, not of relief, but of a pain so deep it felt physical. James fell to his knees right there on the empty bridge, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel the pain, the despair, but also, just for a fragile second, the love that still existed somewhere buried beneath the ruins. He didn't know it yet, but that night on the bridge wouldn't be the end of his story. It would just be the beginning. James couldn't remember how he'd gotten home that early morning. His legs carried him automatically, as if his body had made a decision his mind hadn't yet fully processed. He entered quietly, trying not to wake Sarah and Emma. But Sarah was awake, sitting in the dark living room, waiting. "Where have you been?" Her voice held no anger, just a deep, almost indifferent weariness. That tone hurt more than any scream. James stood in the doorway, unable to form words. How could he explain that he had been on the bridge? How could he admit that he had considered leaving them forever? The silence stretched between them like an abyss. "I need help." The words came out as a strangled whisper. 3 simple words that had taken 3 years to emerge. "Sarah, I need help. I can't do this alone anymore." It was the first time in months that Sarah saw the man she loved behind the curtain of apathy and anger. Tears streamed down her face as she stood and hugged him. James broke down. There, in the dark room of his house, he finally allowed himself to fall completely, knowing someone was there to hold him. The next morning, Sarah made an emergency appointment with a psychiatrist. James wanted to protest, make excuses, postpone it again, but the memory of the bridge, Emma's message, Sarah's expression kept his resolve fragile but present. Dr. Marcus Chen's office was different from what James had imagined. No stereotypical couch, no intimidating clinical atmosphere, just a comfortable room with cozy chairs and a window overlooking a small garden. Dr. Chen was a middle-aged man of Asian descent with a gentle expression but piercing eyes that seemed to see through the masks James had spent years constructing. "Tell me about yourself, James," Dr. Chen began unhurriedly, without judgment. And James spoke. Hesitantly at first, then in torrents. He spoke about the pressure at work, about constantly feeling like a fraud, about the sleepless nights, about the crushing guilt of letting Sarah and Emma down. He spoke about the dark thoughts that haunted him, about feeling like a burden, about the night on the bridge. Dr. Chen listened intently, taking occasional notes, asking questions that unlocked deeper layers. There were no magic solutions offered, no empty motivational sermons, just genuine listening, and for the first time, validation that what James felt was real and had a name. "James, you are suffering from severe clinical depression," Dr. Chen explained clearly and compassionately. "This is not a weakness of character. It's not something you can simply overcome with willpower. It's a medical condition that affects your brain chemistry, your perception of yourself and the world." Hearing this was both liberating and frightening. Liberating because he finally had a name for the monster that haunted him. Frightening because it meant accepting that he was sick, that he needed treatment, that the journey ahead would be long. Dr. Chen prescribed antidepressants and recommended weekly therapy. "Medication will help stabilize your brain chemistry," he explained, "but therapy is crucial to addressing thought patterns and underlying causes. This isn't a quick fix, James. It's a process. There will be good days and bad days, but you don't have to face this alone anymore." The first few days on the medication were challenging. James experienced nausea, paradoxical insomnia, and a strange feeling of disconnection. Dr. Chen had warned about initial side effects. "Give your body time to adjust," he advised. "It usually takes 4 to 6 weeks to feel the real benefits." Meanwhile, therapy sessions began. James was referred to Dr. Lisa Kowalski, a therapist specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy. Lisa was direct but empathetic. She didn't let James wallow in self-pity, but she also didn't minimize his pain. The following weeks were the most difficult of James's life, not because things were necessarily getting worse, but because he was finally confronting years of pent-up pain. It was as if, by opening the door to treatment, he had released a flood of emotions he had kept bottled up for so long. "Why am I not getting better faster?" James asked Dr. Lisa during the 3rd session, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm already taking the medication. I come here every week. Why do I still feel so empty?" Lisa leaned forward slightly, her gaze firm but gentle. "James, you've spent 3 years building this hole. You're not going to climb out of it in 3 weeks. Recovery isn't linear. There will be ups and downs, days when you feel like you're progressing and days when it feels like you're back to square one. That's normal. That's part of the process." But understanding it intellectually was one thing. Experiencing that reality was entirely different. There were mornings when James would wake up and for a few precious seconds forget the weight he carried. Then consciousness would return like a wave, bringing with it all the familiar darkness. Getting out of bed felt like a heroic achievement some days. Sarah was trying to be strong, but James could see the weariness in her eyes. She had become a caregiver as well as a wife, keeping the house running, caring for Emma, working full-time. The bills were piling up without James's salary. He had started looking for work, but each rejection was a confirmation of his worst beliefs about himself. "I'm a burden," he told Lisa during a particularly difficult session. "Look at what I've done to my family. Sarah is exhausted. Emma barely recognizes me. We're struggling financially. Maybe they really would be better off without me." "Stop," Lisa interrupted firmly. "That's your depressed brain talking, not reality. Let's look at the real facts. Sarah is here because she chooses to be. Emma loves you unconditionally. Yes, there are financial challenges, but they are temporary and manageable." You know what wouldn't be manageable? Emma growing up without her father, Sarah living with the loss of the husband she loved. Do you think that would be better for them? The words hit James like a blow. He had never thought about it from this perspective. He was so consumed by his own grief that he couldn't see how his permanent absence would devastate the people he loved. "Let's do an exercise," Lisa continued. "Every time you have a self-deprecating thought, I want you to write it down. Then write a response as if you were talking to a dear friend who is going through the same thing. Would you tell a friend they are a burden, or would you be compassionate?" The exercise seemed simple, almost silly. But when James began practicing it, something interesting happened. He realized how brutal he was with himself in ways he would never be with anyone else. The critical voice in his head, which he had always assumed was the truth, was actually a ruthless tyrant. One day, about 5 weeks after starting treatment, something subtly changed. James was eating breakfast when he realized he could taste it. It seemed like an absurd observation, but for months, everything had been tasteless, colorless, and sensationless. And here he was, actually savoring the coffee, noticing the crispy toast. It wasn't a miracle cure. The depression was still there, a constant presence. But there was a small opening, a chink of light penetrating the darkness. James almost didn't dare hope, but something inside him began to awaken. That night, Emma asked him to read her a bedtime story. It was something he used to do religiously before depression took over. Over the past few months, he had consistently refused, unable to muster the energy even for it. But that night, he said yes. Sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, the children's book in his hands, James began to read. His voice was hesitant at first, rusty from emotional disuse. Emma snuggled against him, her small body warm. When James finished the story, Emma looked up at him with those big eyes and said, "I missed this, Daddy." James felt something break inside him, but this time it was different. It wasn't the breaking of destruction, but the breaking of a dam, allowing long repressed feelings to flow. He hugged Emma, truly hugged her, for the first time in so long. Recovery, James was learning, wasn't a straight line upward. It was more like a spiral staircase, where sometimes you felt like you were returning to the same places, but in fact, you were on a slightly higher level. There were bad days, terrible days even. But in between, tolerable days began to appear. And occasionally, surprisingly, almost good days. Dr. Chen adjusted the medication at the 8-week mark. "Levels are stabilizing," he explained, "but we'll optimize the dosage to minimize side effects while maximizing benefits." The fog James constantly felt began to lift a bit more. His thoughts, while still often negative, were no longer the chaotic, inescapable whirlwind they once were. In therapy, Lisa introduced practical tools. "Depression robs you of motivation and energy," she explained, "so we can't expect you to feel motivated to do things. We need to create structure and routine that exist regardless of how you feel." Together, they built a minimal morning routine, not something ambitious or overwhelming, but small, manageable steps. Get up at 7, shower, get dressed in clean clothes, eat breakfast. It seemed ridiculously basic, but for someone who had spent months barely able to get out of bed, it was revolutionary. Action before motivation, Lisa repeated like a mantra. You don't have to want to do something to do it. And often, the act of doing generates motivation retroactively. James started walking, not inspirational runs or intense workouts, just 20-minute walks around the block. In the early days, each step felt like it weighed a ton, but he kept going, even when he didn't want to, especially when he didn't want to. Gradually, something changed. The sunlight on his face, the air in his lungs, the simple movement of his body began to make a difference. Science supported it, Dr. Chen had explained. Exercise helped regulate neurotransmitters. But James didn't care about the science at the time. He cared about the fact that after walking, he felt a fraction lighter. Sarah noticed the subtle changes. James started helping with household chores again, little things like washing dishes or folding clothes. He started asking her questions about her day, really listening to her answers. He wasn't the James he'd been before the depression, but he was a James who was present, who was trying. One night after Emma had gone to sleep, Sarah and James sat together on the couch. For the first time in months, there was no electric tension in the air, just a tired but not hostile stillness. "You're coming back," Sarah said softly, her hand finding his. "Slowly, but you're coming back." James squeezed her hand, emotion closing his throat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything, for leaving you to carry it all alone, for disappearing even though I was here." "I know," Sarah replied, tears shining in her eyes. "And I'm here. I'm still here." But not everything was linear progress. There was one particularly difficult day when James received yet another job rejection. It was the 15th. The familiar voice of depression returned with a vengeance. "You're worthless. No one wants you. You'll drag your family down with you." James felt the old despair rising, threatening to consume him again. For a terrifying moment, he thought all progress had been illusory, that he was back where he started. Panic took over, his breathing quickened, his hands trembled. But then something different happened. James remembered the tools Lisa had taught him. He forced himself to breathe deeply, counting to 4 on the inhale, holding for 4 and exhaling for 4. He took out his notebook and wrote down the self-defeating thought. Then, with deliberate effort, he wrote a compassionate response. "You're going through a difficult time. Interview rejections are normal and don't define your worth. You're recovering from a serious illness. Be patient with yourself." The words didn't magically make the pain disappear, but they created a small space between James and his thoughts. A space where he could observe them without being completely consumed by them. It was a new muscle he was learning to exercise, the ability to have a thought without necessarily believing it to be the absolute truth. 3 months after starting treatment, Dr. Chen suggested something James didn't expect. "Have you ever considered joining a support group?" The initial idea terrified James. Share your deepest struggles with strangers? Expose your vulnerability to a group of people? But Dr. Chen was persuasive. There's immense power in realizing you're not alone, and often helping others on their journeys ends up being one of the most healing things we can do for ourselves. Reluctantly, James agreed to give it a try. The group met every Thursday night in a community room at a local church. When James first walked in, he saw a circle of about a dozen people of all ages, genders, and backgrounds. The only common denominator, they all knew the darkness of depression. The facilitator, a man named Robert, who had lost almost everything to depression before finding recovery, created a space of total acceptance. "There's no judgment here," he said. "There's no competition about who's suffering more. There's no shame, just truth and support." At the first meeting, James simply listened. He listened to Maria, a successful lawyer who had attempted suicide twice. He listened to Carlos, a war veteran struggling with PTSD and depression. He listened to Jennifer, a single mother of 3 who was barely functioning but had to be strong for her children. Each story was different in its details, but deeply familiar at its core. James was not alone. He had never been alone. In subsequent meetings, James began to share. He spoke about the bridge, about feeling like a burden, about the painful journey of recovery. And something extraordinary happened. People listened without horror, without condescending pity, only with deep understanding. Many nodded in recognition. Some wept with him. Others shared similar experiences. But the transformative moment came at the fifth meeting. A young man arrived, clearly in acute crisis, barely able to articulate words through his tears. James recognized that look immediately. It was the same look he'd seen on the bridge months earlier, the look of someone who had lost all hope. Without thinking, James approached after the meeting. "Hey," he said gently, "I know where you are right now. And I know it seems impossible to believe, but there is a way out. You don't have to do this alone." The man, whose name was David, looked at James with desperate eyes. "How do you know? How can you be sure?" "Because I was exactly where you are. Worse, maybe. I was literally on a bridge ready to jump. And look where I am now, still struggling, yes. Still having hard days, absolutely. But I'm here. I'm alive. And for the first time in years, I'm starting to believe that being alive is worth it." James shared his number with David, offering to support him between meetings. Over the next few days, they exchanged messages. James offered encouragement, shared strategies he'd learned, but most importantly, he offered his presence. The constant message, "You're not alone in this." The curious thing was that by helping David, James began to heal more deeply. There was something powerfully therapeutic about using his own pain to ease someone else's suffering. His experience, which had seemed merely destructive and meaningless, suddenly had purpose. It could be a light for others lost in the darkness. Lisa smiled when James shared this in therapy. This is part of what Viktor Frankl called the search for meaning. When we find purpose in our suffering, when we transform it into something that can help others, the nature of suffering changes. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes more bearable. James began exploring other ways to create purpose. He volunteered at a suicide prevention hotline, undergoing intensive training. He wasn't ready to work directly on the calls yet, but he helped with administrative tasks, feeling part of something bigger than himself. He also started writing. Nothing elaborate, just an anonymous blog where he documented his journey with brutal honesty. He wrote about the bad days, the small victories, and the tools he was learning. To his surprise, people started reading. Comments began to appear. "Thank you for sharing this. I feel less alone. Your story gave me hope. Today was particularly difficult, but reading your words helped me keep going." James realized something profound. His darkest pain was becoming his greatest source of connection and purpose. James's recovery was progressing, but one area remained delicate and complex: his relationships, especially with Sarah and Emma. Depression had opened deep wounds, and simply getting better didn't magically heal them. Sarah had carried an immense burden, months of being the sole provider, of caring for Emma alone, of watching the man she loved disappear into an empty shell. She had developed her own survival patterns, emotional walls, hypervigilance, constant preparation for the worst. Even as James improved, she struggled to fully trust that the improvement was permanent. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted during a couples therapy session Lisa had recommended. "I'm scared of opening up completely and then you disappearing again. I don't know if I can go through that again." The honesty cut James deeply, but he understood. He had broken her trust repeatedly during her darkest months. Rebuilding it would take time, consistency, and patience. Couples therapist Dr. Anderson helped them set realistic expectations. "You're not trying to go back to the way things were. You're building something new based on what you've experienced. Sarah, you have every right to have boundaries and to process your own grief. "James, your recovery is important, but Sarah also needs support to heal." James hadn't fully realized Sarah needed help too. She had developed significant anxiety, always expecting the next crisis. She began her own therapy, working through the trauma of witnessing James's downfall and the constant fear of losing him. Together, they developed new ways of communicating. James learned to be open about his emotional states. "Today is hard, but I'm managing it. I need space, but I'm not disappearing." Sarah learned to express her needs without blame. "I'm exhausted today. I need you to take responsibility for Emma." Small rituals helped. Sunday breakfasts together, where they talked honestly about the week. Nightly walks after Emma fell asleep, just holding hands in comfortable silence. It wasn't a movie romance, but it was real, honest, and gradually it was becoming solid again. With Emma, the situation was different, but equally complex. At 7, she didn't fully understand what had happened to her father, only that he had changed, become distant, and then slowly returned. This created a subtle insecurity. She constantly tested, "Is Dad really here? Will Dad stay?" James had to learn a new way of fathering. He established consistent rituals, reading to Emma every night, taking her to the park on Saturdays, making pancakes together on Sunday mornings. No matter how he felt, these rituals happened. Consistency, he learned, was the love language Emma needed to hear most. There was one particularly touching moment. Emma was drawing at the table when she suddenly asked, "Daddy, were you sick? Is that why you were sad?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, dear. Daddy was very sick. An illness you can't see, that stays inside your head and heart, but I'm getting better now. And even when I'm having a hard day, it doesn't mean I don't love you. Do you understand?" Emma thought for a moment, then nodded. "Like when I got chickenpox and couldn't play, but I was still me?" "Exactly like that," James smiled, touched by his daughter's simple wisdom. James's family had also been affected. His parents, elderly and from another generation, struggled to understand depression as an illness. "Just try harder," his mother said with good intentions, but painful ignorance. "When I was sad, I just worked harder and it passed." Lisa worked with James on setting healthy boundaries. "You don't have to make everyone understand completely. Some never will. But you can set limits on what's acceptable in terms of comments and pressure." James had difficult conversations with his parents. "I know you don't fully understand, and that's okay, but I need you to respect that this is real, that I'm in treatment, and that comments minimizing my condition aren't helpful." It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Some family members adapted, others remained distant. James learned to accept that he couldn't control other people's reactions, only his own. 6 months after starting treatment, James faced a fundamental question. Who was he now? Depression had destroyed his former identity. He was no longer the confident sales manager, the unquestionable provider for his family, the person who had everything under control. But he was also no longer just the depressed person. He was somewhere in between, and he needed to discover who this new James was. "Identity isn't static," Lisa explained. "You've been through something that fundamentally changed you. It's not about going back to who you were, but about discovering who you're becoming. And that's scary, but it can also be liberating." The job issue loomed large. Savings were running low. Sarah was exhausted from carrying the financial burden. James needed to work again, but the thought of returning to the high-pressure corporate environment that had contributed to his downfall was terrifying. "Maybe it doesn't have to be the same kind of work," Sarah gently suggested during one of their Sunday conversations. "Maybe this is an opportunity to rethink what you really want to do." It was a radical concept for James. He'd followed a traditional path his entire life, college, MBA, and then climbing the corporate ladder. He'd never really asked himself what he wanted, only what was expected. With Lisa's encouragement, James began to explore what truly brought him fulfillment. He realized that the times he felt most alive recently were when he was helping others in the support group, when he was writing on his blog, when he was volunteering. Maybe there was a path there. James began researching peer counseling certification programs. These programs train people with lived experience in mental health to support others in recovery. It wasn't formal therapy that would require years of additional education, but it was a legitimate way to turn his experience into a profession. The decision wasn't easy. It meant starting over in a completely different field, with a starting salary much lower than what he'd earned before. James struggled with his ego, feelings of lowering himself, and fear of others' judgment. "Whose standards are you measuring success by?" Lisa challenged. "Society's standards? Your family's? Or your own values and needs? You almost died chasing a definition of success that was killing you. Maybe it's time to redefine what success means to you." The words resonated deeply. James enrolled in the certification program. Meanwhile, he took a part-time job at a local bookstore. It paid poorly, but it was low pressure, allowed flexibility to continue the treatment and certification program, and honestly, it was enjoyable. Being surrounded by books, having simple, human interactions with customers, without the relentless pressure of sales targets and corporate politics. His colleagues at his former company heard about it. Some reacted with barely concealed pity. What a shame. James had so much potential. Others with genuine confusion. Why would anyone leave a promising career to work in a bookstore? There were times when James internalized these reactions, feeling like a failure. But then he remembered. These same people didn't see him on the bridge. They didn't see Sarah exhausted to the point of collapse. They didn't see Emma afraid of her own father. The success he perceived in their eyes was literally costing him his life. The certification program was challenging but deeply meaningful. James learned about trauma-informed learning, active listening techniques, professional boundaries, and self-care to prevent burnout. He was surrounded by others who had lived their own journeys through mental health, addiction, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD. There was a camaraderie, a mutual understanding that James had never experienced in previous professional settings. During one of the classes, the instructor said something that stuck with James. "Your scars aren't your flaws. They're your credentials. You've been through something many will never understand and you survived. That gives you a wisdom and empathy that can't be taught in any classroom." James began an internship at a mental health recovery center, working directly with people at various stages of their journeys. It was emotionally demanding in ways his corporate job never was, but also infinitely more rewarding. When someone who had contemplated suicide shared a small moment of hope, James felt like he was making a real, tangible difference. A year after that night on the bridge, James thought he had overcome the worst. He was working, contributing financially again, and his relationships were healing. The depression, though still present to a lesser extent, seemed manageable. He had begun to believe the nightmare was over. Then autumn came. The leaves fell, the days shortened, and something inside James began to slip. It was subtle at first. More difficulty getting out of bed, less pleasure in the activities he had once enjoyed, that familiar fog beginning to descend again. "No," James thought with growing panic. "Not again. I did everything right. Why are you coming back?" Anxiety about his depression returning ironically accelerated its recurrence. James began to isolate himself again, ashamed, as if the relapse were a personal failure, proof that he was fundamentally broken and beyond repair. Sarah noticed immediately. "James, you're getting distant again." "I'm fine," he lied, his usual automatic response, but he wasn't fine, and they both knew it. It was Sarah who gently and firmly pushed him to call Dr. Chen. "You promised me you wouldn't do this alone again. call the doctor. Dr. Chen wasn't surprised. Relapses happen, James, especially in the first year of recovery. It doesn't mean you've failed or that all your progress has been lost. It means we need to adjust our treatment. But James was devastated. He had worked so hard. He had done everything right, taken his medication faithfully, gone to therapy, exercised, maintained routines, helped others. And yet, here he was, sliding back into the abyss. In therapy, Lisa confronted her all-or-nothing thinking. You're seeing this as binary. Either you're cured or you're broke. But recovery from chronic depression isn't like that. It's management. Like someone with diabetes who sometimes needs to adjust their insulin, or someone with asthma who has occasional flare-ups even with treatment. So it'll never end? James asked desperately. I'll have to fight this forever. Possibly, Lisa answered honestly. Or maybe not. Everyone is different. But what I can tell you is that you have tools now that you didn't have before. You recognized the signs early. You asked for help quickly. You have a support network. The relapse didn't take you back to square one because you built a foundation. Dr. Chen adjusted his medication and temporarily increased the frequency of therapy sessions. James stepped up his self-care practices. More exercise, daily meditation, limiting stressful news, and spending more time in nature. But perhaps most importantly, James was honest with his support group. I'm relapsing, and I'm terrified, he shared, his voice breaking. I feel like I've failed all of you, especially after being someone others looked to for support. Robert, the facilitator who had first welcomed James a year earlier, responded with wisdom born of experience. James, you haven't failed us. You're showing us something crucial. That recovery isn't perfect, that strong people relapse too, and that seeking help during a relapse is courage, not weakness. You're modeling exactly what we all need to see. Robert's words shifted something in James's perspective. Perhaps his relapse wasn't a failure, but part of his ongoing journey. Perhaps vulnerability in the midst of struggle was as valuable as strength. David, the man James had helped months earlier and who was now in more stable recovery, took James's phone after the meeting. Hey, you were there for me when I was at my lowest. Let me be here for you now. There was something deeply moving about being cared for by someone he had helped. The cycle of giving and receiving, of helping and being helped, was complete. The relapse lasted about 6 weeks. It wasn't as severe as the original episode, partly because James intervened early, partly because he had more resources. It was still terrible. There were still days when he could barely function, but this time he wasn't alone in the darkness. And this time he knew for certain that the darkness would eventually recede. 18 months after the bridge, James was preparing for his first public talk on mental health at the local community center. His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't the fog of depression, but ordinary nervousness. There was something comforting in recognizing the difference. He could feel normal anxiety without panicking that he was relapsing. Are you ready? Sarah asked. Emma had made a card. Daddy, you're the bravest. In the room, 40 people gathered. James saw faces of all ages, some with that look he instantly recognized, the look of someone struggling. James began by going back to that night on the bridge. He spared no detail. He described the pain, the despair, how genuinely he believed everyone would be better off without him. I didn't know I was sick, he continued. I thought I was weak, a failure, fundamentally flawed. It took me being on the brink of death to admit I needed help. He talked about the journey, medication, therapy, ups and downs, rebuilding relationships, career change, and relapse. He didn't romanticize anything. Recovery isn't linear. I still have difficult days, but now I have tools, support, and hope. Not blind hope, but realistic hope that I can manage the challenges. A young woman timidly asked about stigma. James replied, My desire to help others overcame my fear of judgment. For every person who judges, there are 10 who are grateful for honesty. After the event, a tearful mother thanked them. My son is struggling. Your story gave me hope. A young man shared that he was now going to get help. In the car, Sarah took his hand. I'm so proud of you. Funny, James reflected. I used to define success by promotions. Now it's when I use my pain to light someone else's path. At home, Emma asked, "Did you tell her about when you were sick?" Yes, and it helped people who were also sad. The bad thing turned into something good, Emma thought seriously. So you're like a superhero who uses your scars to help people? James smiled excitedly. I think we can all be that kind of superhero, honey. 2 years after the bridge, James stood in the same spot, but this time he wasn't alone. And he wasn't contemplating the end. I was there with a group of volunteers from the Suicide Prevention Hotline, walking across the bridge as part of an awareness event. Yellow ribbons were tied along the railing, each representing a life lost or saved. It was here, James told the group, his voice firm but thick with emotion. It was exactly here that I almost gave up, and now I'm here, helping to ensure that others don't reach that point. The journey had completely transformed James. He now worked full-time as a certified peer counselor, earning less than his corporate life, but infinitely richer in purpose. His blog had grown, reaching thousands of people. He received weekly messages from people saying his words had kept them going for another day. Sarah stood beside him on the bridge, as did Emma, now 9. The family had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, not despite the suffering, but through it. The scars remained, but they no longer defined who they were. Daddy, Emma asked, do you still get sad sometimes? Yes, dear, James answered honestly. Sometimes I still do. But now I know that sadness is temporary, and I know how to ask for help when I need it. Dr. Chen had gradually reduced the medication, though James was still on a maintenance dose. Therapy with Lisa continued, now monthly instead of weekly. The tools he had learned had become second nature. Morning meditation, regular exercise, social connections, healthy boundaries, recognizing triggers. But perhaps the greatest transformation was internal. James had learned that his depression wasn't his identity. It was something he had, not something he was. He had learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. That vulnerability created a deeper connection than any mask of perfection. He had learned to redefine success, not by external standards, but by his own values. Success now meant being there for his daughter. It meant making a difference in one person's life at a time. It meant living authentically, even when difficult. In the support group, James was now what Robert had been to him. Someone who had walked through the darkest valley and returned to light the way. He saw new members arrive with that desperate look he recognized so well, and he could offer something precious, living proof that recovery was possible. David, his friend from the group, now also worked in mental health. Maria, the lawyer, had returned to work, but with new limits. Carlos had found peace through specialized therapy for veterans. The group was a tapestry of stories of resilience. As the sun set over the bridge, James tied his own yellow ribbon to the railing. It read, "For the life I almost lost, and for the life I choose to live." Sarah hugged him. Emma held his hand, and James realized that the bridge, which had almost been his end, had become a symbol of his rebirth. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly. James looked at his family, thought about the people he had helped, felt the weight of purpose he now carried. "Yes," he replied, and for the first time in years, it was completely true. "I'm fine, and more importantly, I know that even when I'm not, you'll be fine again." The darkness hadn't completely disappeared from James's world. It probably never would. But he had learned to carry enough light within himself to see it through, and in doing so, he had become a beacon for others lost in the night. James didn't just survive, he was reborn. If you made it this far, maybe something in James's story spoke to you too. Maybe it reminded you that even after the darkest nights, there's still a way forward. One step, one breath, one choice at a time. If this video brought you a moment of reflection or hope, consider subscribing. That's how we keep building this space together. A place where stories like this one find meaning and remind us we are not alone. And hey, if you're still here right now, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you till the end." I'd love to know who stayed to the last word. It really means a lot. Before you go, there's another video here on the side that continues this conversation. Click and come with me. Let's keep walking together.